Welcome to another episode of Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington. Do you feel like an American?
I don't claim to be an American. In fact, I don't even claim to be Asian American because I am a new immigrant. Why are there laws to impede you from having an abortion? Because it's a personal choice. So how are we ever going to change or shift that narrative as an entire human population if we keep allowing whiteness to be centered and not other voices?
Today, we have a really exciting conversation with one of my dearest friends. Her name is Leng Leng Chancey, and she is the former executive director of 9 to 5 for working women, but now has broken off and is doing her own thing as a strategic advisor to philanthropy. We are currently sitting together, which is unusual for Sticky Notes. I'm usually always doing virtual interviews because I travel a lot and, we got to get this in on a weekly basis. But Leng Leng and I happen to be together in a very fabulous place, looking out at the Caribbean. Oh, it's the Caribbean Sea? The Caribbean Sea, not the Caribbean Ocean. We are looking out at the Caribbean Sea, just enjoying each other's company and having an opportunity to unwind and relax and think strategically about what happens next and what we want to do next. So what better time to break out the microphone and have a conversation about life, democracy, the election, freedom, liberation, margaritas, all of the above. So I'd like to welcome you, Leng Leng, to this episode of Sticky Note Conversations. And as always, I'd like for you to introduce yourself however you see yourself in the world. Who are you, Leng Leng?
Thank you, Erika. Thank you for having me on this show. It's very exciting. I am Leng Leng Chancey. Currently, I think, as you mentioned, I broke out and is doing my own thing right now, and my consultancy is called Rearranger Consulting. And I feel like all throughout my career, I have been a rearranger of sorts, pulling people together, building bridges, doing community organizing work for so long, and also helping people to move in different ways, and so that we can work towards liberation. And I haven't stopped doing that since I stepped away from my executive director role. So I hope in this next iteration of my career path is to do more of that, right? To do more rearranging in communities, and also hopefully move more money down to the community so that folks on the ground that are doing the hard work can get resource.
So tell me about how you got started. When you went to college or what have you, is this where you thought you'd end up? Did you think you'd end up in philanthropy or even organizing at all?
No, I came to this country in 1993 to attend college, and I haven't left since. So I've been here now more than I have been in the country where I was raised and born, which is Singapore. So how
does that feel?
It feels, I don't know. Some days I'm like, it feels weird. Some days I feel like it's kind of a difficult, how do you say, like, you're neither here nor there, and when people talk about diaspora, like, I feel it extremely, like, deep inside me, because now when I go home to visit my home country, it's like I'm not really part of that country anymore. And but being in this country and now as a citizen of this country, I still don't feel the kind of like very as rooted as I am. So it's a kind of I feel like I'm always floating.
Do you feel like an American?
I think It's very difficult for me to describe myself as an American because I always claim, and I say this in every space that I enter, that I am actually a new immigrant to this country. I don't feel like earlier on when I was going to school and later on when I became a citizen, that people treated me like an American. And I don't claim to be an American. In fact, I don't even claim to be Asian American because I am a new immigrant. Mm-hmm.
And what's the difference with that? What is the difference between being an Asian American and a new immigrant?
I think culturally, there's a lot of difference. I remember once when I was working for a language access organization, and on one of the annual, what you call it, the annual, like when your supervisor grades you, what is that?
Oh, like your
annual
evaluation.
Yes. So at one of my annual evaluation, I did really well on every category, like exceeding well. And my supervisor dinged me on my communications because she said that I'm in America now and I should learn to communicate like an American.
What does that mean?
And what she meant by that is that I need to be more straightforward in my communication, be more direct. But, she didn't take into account the nuance of how I was brought up in my culture, like the level of respect, the kind of like things that you're taught growing up, And so even if I had a disagreement with my supervisor, it's not in my nature to confront my supervisor. So that's what she said. She told me that now that I'm in America, I need to be like an American and communicate like an American.
Sort of sounds like she's saying you need to sort of be a jerk. Do you feel like you communicate more like an American now, or do you still feel like that's just not who you are? You're just not a confrontational person?
I'm just not a confrontational person, and I can be confrontational if I have to, but I also think that communication is such a personal attribute, and one person's style is not necessarily the style for somebody else. So, I think her evaluation on that point is extremely flawed. Yeah.
Okay. So back to your matriculation into this work. What was your first organizing job, and how did you catch the bug to want to, do some political or civic engagement organizing?
It's funny. So I started my nonprofit career in fundraising, and a lot of my friends were organizers, but I didn't really understand what organizing means. My first organizing experience really was the elementary school in our neighborhood was going to be redistricted and was about to close. So my son was in kindergarten at that time. And I was like, our school is within walking distance from my house. I don't want the school to close. So I started getting involved, with my neighbor who, we went to every meeting, we listened to every meeting. And back then, in the elementary school, we didn't even have electronic email addresses. Mm-hmm. So we had a directory booklet. And so my neighbor and I spent hours in her basement manually entering all the addresses, all the email addresses of all the parents into a spreadsheet. And then because I was, doing work in fundraising and I knew how to make an e-blast and get, so we purchased Constant Contact and we uploaded all the addresses. And every day, every other day, after our meeting with, listening to what the school district was saying, we would type out in an e-blast and send it to our parents to engage them, to tell them this is happening. So that was my first foray into organizing without really understanding that was what organizing was.
Did y'all win?
We did.
So the school got to stay open, and it was because of the parent power,
Yes.
basically, is what happened. And so, it sounds like one of those Lifetime movies where the parents all get together and they fight back and they win. And we know a lot of those are based on true stories. And we also know that that's how things move, and that we all have the power to make change, or to, keep certain things in our neighborhoods that we need. Like, that is reproductive justice, to be able to have the resources and the things that you need around you and in the space and where you live. And so it's inspiring that it goes from that to where you are now. So once you did that, once you organized and you saved the school, what came next?
So after that, I was also reading a lot about, so taking a step back, when I first came to go to school here in America, the first time I saw a pro-life sticker, a bumper sticker on somebody's car, I was like, what is that? So I asked my friend who's American, and she was explaining to me that in this country, there are two sects of people. Either, you're pro-life or you are pro-choice. So, and growing up in my country, as a young person, I always knew that abortion access was very readily available. In fact, when I was a child, I would hear my mom and my aunts having these kind of conversations in the kitchen. And they would always say, oh yeah, abortion at the government clinic is only $5. So, yes, wow. And so I never grew up understanding, like, why are there laws to impede you from having an abortion? Because it's a personal choice. And so, after the school situation, and I was reading up a lot about reproductive justice, and I actually invited a group of my Asian American friends and other Asian friends to my house for a brunch, because I really want to talk about this issue. And I live in Georgia, so it's very conservative. And when I was doing all my research, I thought, oh, maybe we should start like a group or an organization to do some reproductive justice training for community members like myself. And I found out that there is a national group, AAPI group, that actually does reproductive justice, which is the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. So I got my friends to come for a brunch at my house in my kitchen, and I started talking about NAPAF, which is short for what they're called. And I said, what if we form a chapter here in Georgia? And we start, promoting this and doing some education amongst ourselves, like we could do something with it. So that was my real second entree into let's get this group together. And so we actually formed the chapter of NAPAF in Georgia.
How many women? Or was it all women?
It was all women, and it was all AAPI women and girls. So there were 5 of us that actually got together because we needed 5 people to start a chapter. And so we all invested and became a donor and started a chapter.
Do you remember how much that cost to do?
I think membership was like $50. Everybody had to give $50 or something like that. Yeah.
So it was a smaller amount in order to be engaged with this larger group. And then what is it that you all set out to do? Were you trying to educate people in Georgia, in your community, around what reproductive justice was? Or were you holding any sort of classes or events? What did you all work on?
So when we first started out, we were we talked about topics that we wanted to address, and how we could raise money, how we could do events, to educate or get people together, right? Kind of like a dinner table conversation. So that's how our group started. But the funny thing is, a year into founding the chapter, myself and another founder of our group, we actually went to work for the national organization. And so, the rest, as they say, is history. I got to have a dream job and really like explore what that means for our community. And yeah, I mean, I love the work and I learned so much, and I think that we always think that, oh, reproductive justice or reproductive freedom is, like there has not been enough focus in terms of like talking about it in other communities. So that really opened the door for me to say, hey, you know what? We immigrants, we Asian people, like the Asian community is so big. How do we like have different nuanced conversation amongst the different ethnic groups? So I loved it. I love every minute of working at NAPAF.
That makes me think about this current battle around abortion specifically, because as we know, reproductive justice is so much more than abortion, but that seems to be the hot topic right now, a lot because of Dobbs, and which is the overturning of Roe versus Wade, but also, it's on the ballot in many states, including Nevada. We're going to have a ballot initiative that people will vote on in November that will help really seal and make abortion accessible and a part of our Constitution, which is really important. But in these conversations, a lot of times what we are hearing in the media or what have you is that different ethnic groups, whether it's Asian or Black folks or whoever, and they're saying, oh, they don't want to talk about abortion or what have you. And it sounds to me as though it was not so much, I don't want to call it not a big deal, but it was something that it was a medical procedure. You growing up hearing about it, it was a medical procedure that if someone needed to go get it done, they had an opportunity to go get it done, not as taboo as I feel like it is right now to have these conversations. Do you think that, I'm trying to think about how I want to frame the question. Do you feel as though maybe it's more media rhetoric that people are more conservative around abortion than it actually is? Or do you think that, because there are different, obviously subsects of different Asian communities. And so I'm sure there are different folks who are very conservative and anti, and then other folks who are not. But overall, do you think that it really is as much of a hot button issue as the media makes it out to be? And when I say the media, I just mean what we're hearing on the news versus how people actually feel. Did people feel open and ready to talk about these things as you all were gathering and starting the chapter of the organization?
I think it depends on which, like, again, like in the Asian community, we have hundreds of different ethnic groups, right? And so and that's also part of the problem, because most of the time data is not desegregated, right? So they lump us all in together. But I can speak like from my personal experience. I think the country that I grew up and also like what I know of some other Asian countries is like, I think America as a society, it is very tied to religion. I mean, in God we trust, right? And where I grew up, our country is not tied to any singular religion, right? And so it's a different kind of mentality and culture to begin with. Because, I always said this to people. I'm like, if I have cancer and I decide not to receive any kind of treatment, there's no law that tells me that I have to receive treatment. So electing to have an abortion is also a personal choice. Like, who is out there supposed, like telling me I can't do this? It's my body. So what is the difference between having cancer and electing to have an abortion? Right. And so I think that culturally in this country, people have this sense of moral kind of like moral righteousness of what is right and wrong. When, we talk about individualism and liberty to make choices, but still, right? It's like only some choices are afforded to you and not others.
And then I think it's a sense of entitlement too. I think there is a large sense of entitlement over other people's decisions. I take, for example, we have organized people who are on cash assistance, TANF, and or just, any sort of government welfare assistance. And you will hear conversations or read stories or comments on the internet about people saying what somebody can and cannot buy, with their food stamps or what have you, and really wanting to police how people eat or, and where they live and how they live and, what they buy because they're poor. And it's like, you're not allowed to, eat a steak or have crab legs or what have you, not thinking about it in a cultural sense, or just to have a good meal. Like, I guess you should only eat those prepackaged ramen noodles and processed cheese and other things that are going to, keep you sick for more than anything, and high blood pressure. But I think that sense of entitlement to tell others what they should be doing with their bodies is atrocious. Number one, I don't know if it's an American thing per se, because I've never lived anywhere else, but I do know that they are looking to pull back the rights, in other countries as well. There's like a wave of this happening, and it's not just happening in the United States. And that's the other point of realizing that we are not really siloed in that way, that once you start taking away rights in one space, that gives people the idea and the carte blanche to do it somewhere else, and vice versa. There are things happening in other countries, then people are like, oh, that's a good idea. We should go ahead and take those rights away from folks here too, because it'll give us more control. So we really have to start looking at ourselves, I think, as global citizens and paying attention to what's happening, all over the place, and really care about it.
Yeah, I think for me, when I'm listening to you, it kind of takes me back to like colonization and imperialism, right? And like in the global context that we are in, like who has the power to build narrative and shift narrative, right? So America and the West is always seen like the big brothers and the people to protect the rest of the world that can't protect themselves, right? And so much of that narrative is enforced throughout the world of who the Western world is, right? So that like proximity to the West and to whiteness is so strong as a global culture that I feel like sometimes people are not even thinking about it. When they see something happening, it's like, oh, maybe we should adopt that. But is that a white-centered piece of law that we should follow? Or is it like culturally acceptable in our country? Right. So I think that the narrative of the West is so strong. And again, how the West got into all this power is really taking resources away from countries that they colonized. And I grew up in the shadow of a British colony, and we only got our independence in 1965. So we are also a very young nation when I was growing up. So, like going to school, oh, if you speak English well, you're accepted because that is the cool thing, right? Like you are accepted into the, oh yeah, former British colony. Blah, blah, blah. So I feel like now that I'm much older and I've seen the world from different perspectives, I still feel like, we don't talk enough about the origin of where our society and where our global world is, and we're still centering whiteness. So how are we ever going to change or shift that narrative as an entire human population if we keep allowing whiteness to be centered and not other voices?
And so you have two children who are not really children anymore. They are very young adults, college age, young people who are, voting now too. They're able to vote. Do you have these type of conversations with them? And are you surprised by anything that they say or thinking, or has it changed how you thought about things, looking at it from their point of view?
Yeah, unfortunately for my children, we are a very politicized household. So ever since they can remember, like they were going to rallies with me, they were out protesting in the streets with me. And so, they kind of grew up right in that environment. And I remembered, so the back when they were in elementary school, there was also a period of time where the T-Mobile came into the school and wanted to put a cell phone tower in their school backyard. And so my son, at the time, I think he was like in second or third grade, we went door to door to collect signatures to say we're against it. And he was actually the one from door to door. He was telling the adults why he doesn't want a cell phone tower built on his playground. So my children are extremely politicized. And my son actually took a year off after he finished high school to become a community organizer for a year and doing civic engagement work. So I know they're going to vote, with an open eye and really understand what issues matters to them and to our community.
Do you see, your children were born in the United States. Do you see a vast difference in how they think versus how you grew up thinking as not being an American citizen as a child and growing up? Is there a lot of similarities, or is it really different?
I think there's definitely a lot of difference. My children are much more well versed and much more articulate than I was when I was growing up. In my culture, it was like you don't go against what your parents tell you, right? And but I was always that odd child who always fought with my parents and was a very difficult child because I always felt like, why can't I say what I want to say? So I pushed back a lot, which, my mom used to joke. She's like, you were born with a set of curly hair. The moment I saw you, I knew you were going to be trouble.
It was that curly hair.
It was that curly hair, right? And in my culture, is like most children are not born with a set of curly hair. But I came out that way. So my mom was like, oh, she knew I was going to be trouble. But I think I've observed that my children have a lot more freedom in speech compared to when I was growing up. So that's a huge difference. Yeah.
And so thinking about, the future, and it's something that I do a lot now that my children are also coming into all being, voting age and growing up and figuring out where they fit in this world. I think about democracy and I think about liberation, and I've had some of those conversations here on the podcast with two of my children. How do you define democracy, and do you think we have it right now in this moment?
Oh, that's a tough one. Talking about democracy. I think in this country, I don't think we are as democratic as we say we are, right? I think that also takes me back again. Like it's all a question of who has power and who doesn't, right? When you talked about working with people that are on TANF or on SNAP programs, I think people that have a lot of power in this country, which is predominantly the rich and the white people, and when you look at communities of colors, it's like they are the people that are almost like second class in many sense. right? In so many different environments that I can, as we have so many examples. And I think I remember, I'll just tell you the story. I remember when I was very young in this work. And I remember talking to a social worker one time, and she was like, yeah, that woman that just came in, like she's, blah, blah, blah. And she had $20, but, she didn't have food on the table, but her nails were done. And she's like, why is she wasting money on getting her nails done? Well, first of all, to me, when I listened to her, I was like, number one, there's none of your business. Number two is maybe that's the only way she can show up with some dignity. So who are we to say that she shouldn't have her nails done? Just because she doesn't have money, she shouldn't spend money on herself to make herself, do something for herself. I think that is the idea, right? In this country, that if you are poor, you should not spend, like you said, have a steak. But if you don't have enough access, then you need to like put all your money where we people that have access think you should put your money to where it should go. But we are not them. And everybody has a choice. So why are we dictating what we think should be the right way onto other people? So it goes back to slavery. It goes back to the who's in charge, who has the power, right? So democracy in this country is not really, it's not democracy in its entirety that it should be. And it's not showing up that way for me.
So thinking about democracy, but also thinking about colonialism, how did colonialism affect Singapore? And what do you think it would be like if it had never happened?
I think, I don't know what it would look like if it never happened, because I wasn't there prior to that time. I'm 27, so, I'm fairly young. But I think,
I guess I'm thinking about like culture-wise, do you think there are a lot of things that were lost, or any stories that maybe parents, grandparents, or other elders in your community may have told of, like, things are just different from what they knew it could be? Because it was around for a long time, so not expecting you to know exactly like what it was like in the 1800s or what have you, but something you can just tell, like, this wouldn't be here right now if colonialism never happened. English wouldn't be there. And so, in understanding folks' language better and, being able to celebrate the culture and maybe not feeling as though they need to have a sense of proximity to whiteness or skin color, that sort of thing. Especially when you start talking about colorism and that sort of thing, if that is an issue in Singapore as well. Just wondering how life might have been different.
Yeah, this question always takes me back to my growing up experience. And, so my parents sent me to a convent school because supposedly convent school has better English education. Right. But my family was not, completely English speaking. So we spoke our native tongue, and native dialect. And in my country at the time when I was going to school, English was propped up as like the standard. So no more speaking your native, that we had campaigns that said no more speaking your native language or dialect. Like you should learn to speak only English or Mandarin, which is the standardized Chinese language. But, and so, they tried to have this huge campaign to say no more speaking your native language. And I think it was detrimental because when I was going to school, like I said, because my family is not all English speaking. In fact, we spoke very little English at home. And my mom only has a third grade education. My dad probably has less than a high school education, but they really wanted their children to have a better life. So they sent us to an English speaking school. But when I was in school, especially during middle school years, I really experienced bullying a lot because I was considered a Chinese helicopter, which I know.
Okay,
Yeah. So a Chinese helicopter is somebody who is much more well versed in Mandarin and and dialects, and English is not like their most comfortable, like their strongest language. So I was considered a Chinese helicopter. So I went to school with a bunch of kids that don't speak Mandarin or don't speak, other Chinese dialects, or, so like in that environment, right, I was almost like shunned and like an outcast in some ways because I did not fall into the cool kids category.
So speaking English made you a cool kid, but speaking Mandarin did not. And because you took to those languages better, that made you a Chinese helicopter. That's such an odd thing. You think about bullying and you think about the terms that people use in order to make somebody feel bad. And so you hear Chinese helicopter, and you're like, what? Like, what does that even mean? But I'm assuming that it may have hurt your feelings some. Like, how did you like move around these people and not let it get to you? Or did you let it get to you?
I think at many points in school, it did get to me a lot. I think it just, and growing up, I have a really low self-esteem. So that just added to the complexity of, a very young person coming into, adulthood, right? Like I always had that self-esteem problem because I always feel like I wasn't good enough. I wasn't good enough, like in my English proficiency, I wasn't good enough. But the odd thing is when I came to go to school here, I had a lot of Asian friends that lived in my dormitory. And I was the most, like, English wasn't a problem for me, right? So I was the one that was sent to communicate with the American RAs when there was a problem with, something. So and then my group of Asian friends actually started calling me a banana.
Which is another.
Yes. So they said that I was yellow on the outside, but I was white on the inside because my English was so good. So it's like, again, this notion of that diaspora of not, constantly floating. That's kind of how I feel, like where am I really grounded in? And I'm neither here nor there. So I think, in my career, playing that bridge came very natural to me because I always had to bridge two sides.
This makes me think about rhetoric that I have heard or seen, especially online. I think a lot of times different ethnic groups or cultures sort of compete with each other in ways. And thinking about the Asian American community, I have read multiple comments around just various things, and people are like, oh, well, Asian folks stick together. When they've come to this country and, they've built up financial stability or economic stability where they will, build whole communities. Is how you end up with Chinatown or Koreatown in various cities, right? Do you think that is actually true? Do you think that that Asian American, Asian immigrants, that they actually do stick together in the way that people on the outside believe that they do?
I would say yes, but again, this is human nature, right? If you are an American and you go to a foreign country and you meet a fellow American, like you haven't seen another American in so long, and there is a kind of like a bond, like an instantaneous camaraderie because you understand each other where you're from. So the notion of how these communities get set up is also in that same vein. right? Like if you go to a foreign land and you hear somebody that speaks your language, immediately, instantaneously, you're like, oh my gosh, I found another comrade, I found another friend. So I don't think that happens outside. Like maybe in this country, we view it as something different, but I would say that it's only different because you're seeing it from your perspective. But if you were to put yourself in a different context, you probably want to seek out your own people. Yeah.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. In the last episode of Sticky Note Conversations, we were talking about being in Italy and how Shakaya Cherry Donaldson, who was the guest, talked about she realized her Americanness when she spent time in Italy, when they kept asking where she was from. And she was like, I'm Black. And they're like, no, what are you? She's like, I'm Black. And they're like, and finally she's like, oh, American, I'm American. And she's like, I never thought about it that way, because of how you feel, growing up for a lot of different reasons. And I think, yes, when you go to another country and you hear someone, speaking English, but speaking English in an American accent, because it sounds very different, you're like, oh, okay, now I'll be able to communicate a little bit better, as you're struggling to try to communicate with folks who English is not their first language or their second language, or you're trying to speak their language and probably slaughtering it and chopping it up in all different ways, the way I do Italian. It's like, no one really wants me to speak Italian. And so usually if I do, they'll stop in English and be like, I'm sorry, what did you want? And I'm like, oh, thank goodness. Sorry. I'm trying, really trying. But yeah, it's a really interesting and unique experience. And this is why I'm a big proponent about people traveling and seeing other places, maybe even staying in another place for a good amount of time, because even if you're only there for a month or a couple months, you get a small inkling of the immigrant experience that you don't get if you never leave your homeland and your home country. I would love for you to talk a little bit about what you'd want people to know and understand about the immigrant experience.
Well, that is a loaded question. Yeah. I would say, I mean, if I had a magic wand, I would want to tell everybody, not to judge people, first of all, by the way that they sound, or the skin tone of the skin color, right? But unfortunately, I don't have a magic wand. So I would say that, if you come into contact with immigrants and you feel like, oh, maybe their way of life is not your American way of life, just to have a little perspective, because you're in America, but if you were to live in that country, what would that be like? So, and it's not easy being an immigrant in this country, because it's like relearning everything from what you used to know. So have a little patience and understand that, your perspective may not, could be different than theirs, and that there is room, right, for both sides, to have some learning. And don't call it a melting pot, because when you call it a melting pot, you pretty much, discredit or what is the word that I'm looking for? Like, you devalue all of our cultures.
It becomes you homogenize a whole culture, because if it's a melting pot, then you sort of disappear. That's right. And when you disappear, it's like, well, where is Leng Leng and her flavor? Like, does your flavor come out in this big stew that we have, or does it get drowned out by that hot sauce that we've added on top? So, want to talk a little bit about politics, because you are political, and we all are political in some ways, but you're super political. Tell me your thoughts on this upcoming election. It's 2024, and we joke around here, it's the biggest election of our lives, because they say that about every single election. But how are you feeling? What do you think is going to happen? Do you have predictions um, about where we will be in November?
That's a multi-billion-dollar question. And I say multi-billion-dollar is because I haven't seen enough investment in our community to do this work to get us to the finish line. Right? A lot is up in the air. I feel like Democrats are feeling very secure and too passive. And the other choice on the table is not, it's horrible, it's horrendous. It's, every other word I can, think of. But again, that does not diminish the fact that citizens in this country and people that are of voting age are very unhappy with the current condition of where the country is and where the country is heading. So again, it's a multi-billion-dollar question because there is not enough money on the ground to organize folks and to get us to the finishing line. And so I'm very concerned. I'm very, very concerned. I've been doing this work for too long. And I know every election cycle we say this is the most important. But yes, and that is true that every election cycle is the most important. But again, you can't just say that without providing resources to folks that are really organizing on the ground. And that is going to be my largest worry, that there's not enough money on the ground to resource groups and folks that are doing this work.
So you mentioned that people are unhappy with the way things are right now. How do organizers work on that? Because organizers can't fix the problems that people are having, the struggles, whether it's financial or otherwise. So how do organizers reach those folks and engage with them and get them to, show up at the polls?
Yeah. And, with what's happening in Gaza, and you look at all the young people all throughout this country and throughout the world that are organizing themselves in this fight, I think they are more political than we ever imagined them to be. And they have a cause, right? So are we talking to those folks about what's important? Are we listening to them? Right? I don't think the onus is on all the organizers that are doing civic engagement work, right? I think the conversation is even larger than that. But I think we really need to have a kind of a reckoning moment in this political climate, because I think we need to listen to these young people that are really organizing on the ground on issues that matter to them. So how are we going to talk about issues that matter to them? I think that's the multi-billion-dollar question.
Yeah. So how do we talk to them? Because I have had many conversations with folks of all ages and with different viewpoints on specifically talking about Israel and Palestine. And a lot of the young folks who are spending so much time trying to push back and say, hey, we see this as genocide. And we see this as a humanitarian problem, and we want you to do something about it. We want divestment and all of that. And then they have these encampments. And then I'm hearing, some folks, older folks are like, well, I understand that they have, views, but I don't agree with how they're doing it. I'm not pretty sure like what other way they're supposed to do it and how they're supposed to be heard. But my biggest concern is that the government and the parties are not hearing these young people say, we see what's happening. You can't hide it from us. And you have to actively be doing something. And I am very concerned that they're not going to see any movement as actual progress towards, this humanitarian issue.
Yeah, and I also feel like, the political system and structure in this country is very broken, right? And that's why these young people are looking for a way out almost, right? To do something different. And I think, with the current choices we have on the table, young people also have to understand, like, we always say this in every election cycle, we vote for the lesser of the evils, but maybe it's time for reckoning. What could that look like? Right. And what is it going to take to revolutionize our political structure? So I don't really have all the answers, but I feel like, this year is definitely a very different year than previous election, because there are so many things that are on the table for discussion. And I wish the party leaders in the Democratic party would really start engaging the young people and really listen to them. Things might not be able to be solved immediately, but people are looking for opportunities and answers. So if the Dems are not going to listen to what people have to say, I think it's a slippery slope.
I agree. And I'm not hearing enough from local politicians to even bringing it up. It's almost as if they're afraid to bring it up. And that scares me too, because you can't be afraid to talk about the issues. You have to talk about all of it and talk about it not in a canned statement, but actually say, this is what I see. This is where, we could possibly go. These are a few options. And this is the bigger picture, because there is a bigger picture to the whole thing. And I think we're not even privy to what all of the consequences are for us to either divest in that space, or if they over invest in that space. We just don't know what all that will lead to. And so, question I have to ask before we go: what happens if Donald Trump becomes our president again? What is life? What do you see life and our country being like over the next 4+ years? Because it's also not just the years that they would be in office, but that ripple effect of whatever policies are put into place and all of that. What do you think will happen if Donald Trump returns as president?
I think we will see an authoritarian leadership style. I think he's going to set us back maybe hundreds of years, or even more. And it's going to be horrendous.
Does it scare you?
It scares me. It makes me want to run away. Right? I think it makes a lot of people want to run away, but we can't. And so we have to confront it, and maybe, a revolution could eventually happen. I don't know. But I don't think the liberals in this country are as in tune to the fact that there is a possibility that if he gets elected, what's going to happen. I think people are afraid to talk about it. I think people are not audacious enough in their approach. So if it does come to that, I won't be surprised, because in when he was first elected, all the liberals were surprised. I was not surprised, because y'all let that happen, and it could happen again. And it would be horrible. It would be scary. It would be detrimental to the democracy of our country. But yeah, I think our democracy will be completely destroyed if he gets reelected, or what's left of it.
It's all scary. And when we don't know what's going to happen, I think that scares us even more, because I'm certainly a person who likes to plan things out, and I can't plan that. Well, Leng Leng, I appreciate you so much for sitting down with me in this lovely little space that we're in to have this conversation. I think you are also one of the smartest people I know. And I think that having these sort of conversations, with your friends is also really important. Those kitchen table conversations that you were having around reproductive justice with your friends, these sort of conversations. People can do this. You don't need a microphone. You can just sit down. What do you think? Like where will we go? And then also doing it with our children, I think is really important because they have surprised us and they will continue to surprise us, and we have to support them. So once again, thank you. I appreciate you. I love you. And I am so glad that we are friends. And I am so glad you are continuing to do this work. And now on the consulting side, in consulting philanthropy, to then invest more in communities and in the work that we're all doing so that we can thrive. So help pull that money in from the rich and help give it to those who really need it.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me on the show, Erika. And again, I value our friendship, and I couldn't ask for more of a partner in crime with me. Yay!
Thank you, comrade. All right. That is another episode of Sticky Note Conversations. And I think we ended just in the nick of time. And of course, we'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your conversations that you're having, or thoughts around who else I should have on the show. Please feel free to email me at stickynote@makeitworknevada.org. Again, stickynote@makeitworknevada.org. And thank you again to KUNV and in Las Vegas for airing us every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. and for tuning in on every streaming platform out there. Find us, share us, rate us, like us, all the fun things. And we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Sticky Note Conversations with Erika Washington, hosted and executively produced by Erika Washington, with music, mixing, and editing by Black Gypsy LLC. Special thanks to KUNV 91.5 in Las Vegas. This show is powered by Make It Work Nevada, a project of Tides Advocacy.